On the Eastern Front, 27 million Soviet citizens died. Villages vanished in a single afternoon. Entire cities survived on sawdust bread. And yet the West mainly learns about Normandy. In the next few minutes, you'll see where hell truly was, where armies fought, ideology turned into murder, and winter itself froze people to death. Stay until minute 7. That's where you'll hear about the day an entire city chose to die rather than surrender. 27 million Soviet citizens died on a single front. Villages vanished in an afternoon. Cities survived on sawdust bread. And yet the West mainly remembers Normandy. This was the front where ideology became murder, where winter itself froze soldiers to death. Stay until minute 7. That's when you'll hear how an entire city chose to die rather than surrender. June 22nd, 1941. In one morning, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. Operation Barbarossa, not an ordinary war, but a gamble to decide the fate of Europe. The plan? Reach Moscow within 3 months. The reality? A crusade of erasure. Planes destroyed on the ground, columns of prisoners stretching to the horizon, villages burning. But behind the tanks came something even darker. The Einsatzgruppen. In ravines like Babi Yar, 33,771 people were shot in just 2 days. Not a battle. Industrial murder by bullet. Officers watched. Many joined in. And the message was clear. This front wasn't a line on a map. It was a landscape of killing. Then the blade turned inward. Stalin. Order number 227. Not one step back. Blocking detachments shot anyone who fled. In 1941 alone, 158,000 of their own soldiers were executed. And yet, the army didn't break. Out of fear grew a new will. And on the Neva River began a siege that would last 872 days. But while the Soviets were crushed under their own terror, the Germans were waging one of their own. What began as an invasion had become a war of annihilation. Hitler's command was clear: show no mercy to Bolsheviks, Jews, or civilians. The Eastern Front wasn't a front at all. It was a killing field. Behind the front lines came the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi death squads. Their mission was simple and horrifying: eliminate every Jew, communist, and political officer in occupied territory. They moved from town to town, following the army's advance like a shadow. In Babi Yar, a ravine near Kyiv, more than 33,000 Jews were rounded up in just 2 days. They were told to bring their valuables, stripped and shot in groups, their bodies falling into the pit below. It wasn't a battle. It was industrial murder carried out by bullets instead of gas. And that was only one massacre among hundreds. Across Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, entire communities vanished in weeks. Civilians weren't targeted for what they did. They were killed for who they were. Soviet prisoners of war were starved, shot, or left to die in open fields. The Nazi vision of the East was not to conquer it, but to empty it. Historian Richard Evans described it bluntly. It was genocide disguised as warfare. At the same time, the German army's behavior blurred the line between soldier and executioner. Wehrmacht officers watched, and often joined, the killings. Some protested quietly, but most followed orders. The ideology of extermination had seeped into every trench. For Soviet soldiers and civilians, survival became resistance. They saw what the Germans were doing and swore to return the same cruelty tenfold. As the front lines shifted, so did the morality of war. The longer it lasted, the less human both sides became. But brutality wasn't one-sided. Soon, Soviet vengeance would come crashing down with equal fury. While German tanks rolled toward Moscow, Joseph Stalin was fighting a different war, one against his own people. His paranoia had already gutted the Red Army before the invasion even began. During the Great Purge of the late 1930s, more than 30,000 Soviet officers were executed or sent to gulags. Entire chains of command vanished overnight. The men who might have saved the country were already buried in the snow. When Barbarossa began, that paranoia only deepened. Stalin didn't trust his generals, his soldiers, or even the civilians he claimed to protect. Any retreat, any hesitation, any failure, real or imagined, was seen as betrayal. The result was chaos within chaos. Soldiers who survived the front still had to survive Stalin's wrath. As the Wehrmacht advanced, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, trailed their own army. Their orders were brutal: execute deserters, arrest defeatists, and eliminate anyone spreading panic. Retreating units that stumbled into NKVD checkpoints were often gunned down. In 1941 alone, according to declassified Soviet archives, more than 158,000 Red Army soldiers were executed by their own government for cowardice or treason. That's more than the total American combat deaths in the entire war. When German panzers encircled entire Soviet divisions, captured soldiers were branded traitors the moment they fell into enemy hands. Even if they escaped, Stalin's system would punish them for surviving. Returning POWs were sent to gulags or firing squads. In the rear, civilians were no safer. If someone complained about rations or questioned victory, they could be shot for defeatism. Villagers fleeing advancing German forces were sometimes accused of collaboration and executed by their own side. The front line may have been the most dangerous place on earth, but behind it wasn't far behind. Then came Order Number 227, issued in July 1942. Not one step back. It was Stalin's command that no retreat under any circumstance was allowed. Blocking detachments of NKVD troops were placed behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot anyone who fled. Entire battalions fought, knowing they could die either from German bullets or from their own comrades. And yet, from that terror grew a strange kind of resilience. Soldiers began to fight not for Stalin, but for the soil beneath their feet, for their mothers, wives, and the idea of home. The fear of execution turned into grim determination. The Red Army began to harden, to adapt, to endure. The men who survived Stalin's cruelty became something the Germans had never faced before. Soldiers who had already stared death in the face and refused to break. Yet even under terror, the Soviet people found a grim resolve, one that would freeze the Germans in their tracks. In September 1941, the German army surrounded Leningrad, the second largest city in the Soviet Union and the symbolic heart of Russian Revolution. What followed wasn't a siege in the military sense. It was an attempt to erase a city from the face of the earth. For 872 days, Leningrad was cut off from the world. No food, no supplies, no way out. The Germans bombed warehouses, grain silos, and even hospitals. Winter came early, turning the Neva River into ice. The population, more than 2.5 million people, was trapped. By the first winter, rations fell to 125 grams of bread a day, most of it made from sawdust and ground cellulose. People boiled wallpaper paste for food. They ate leather belts, glue, even candle wax. When dogs, cats, and rats disappeared, rumors spread of darker meals. Diaries tell stories that defy belief. In one, a woman named Tanya Savicheva wrote down the dates as her entire family died one by one. Mother, brother, grandmother, until only she remained. In another, a man describes watching neighbors fight over a dead horse in the street. Historian Anne Reid, in her book Leningrad, Tragedy of a City Under Siege, described the city as a frozen tomb of endurance. Over 1 million civilians died, most from starvation and cold. Bodies lay in the streets for days because there were no men left to bury them. And yet, Leningrad refused to surrender. Even when temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, the Soviet flag stayed up over the smoldering city. Schools tried to stay open. Orchestras played in ruins. In August 1942, conductor Karl Eliasberg led a performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony inside the besieged city. The music broadcast across the front lines as defiance in the face of death. Children carried water through bombed streets. Women manned anti-aircraft guns. Survival became resistance, and every breath was an act of defiance. The Germans believed starvation would break the city. Instead, it became a rallying cry. The word Leningrad turned into a symbol, not of despair, but of unbreakable will. When the siege was finally lifted in January 1944, the city was in ruins, its people ghosts of themselves. But it had never surrendered. But while Leningrad starved, another city would become the graveyard of Hitler's ambitions. By the summer of 1942, Hitler's gaze turned south, to a city that carried Stalin's own name. Taking Stalingrad wasn't just a military objective. It was personal, symbolic, and ideological. The Nazis wanted to crush Soviet morale and seize control of the Volga River, a vital supply artery. In August, German bombers rained fire over the city. Whole districts were flattened in a day. Civilians who didn't flee became trapped in basements, their homes collapsing above them. Firestorms rolled through the streets, sucking oxygen from the air. Yet amid the ruins, the Soviets dug in. Every wall, staircase, and sewer became a front line. When the Germans entered, they didn't find a city. They found a maze of shattered buildings and invisible enemies. Soviet snipers like Vasily Zaitsev turned the ruins into hunting grounds, picking off German officers through cracks in walls. Zaitsev later recalled, "We fought for every brick, for every meter." Combat became hand-to-hand, brutal, intimate, and endless. Soldiers fought with knives, shovels, even bare hands. They called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Neither side could move without risking a bullet from an unseen sniper or a grenade through a window. Then came Operation Uranus in November 1942. The Soviets struck from the north and south, encircling the German Sixth Army. Within days, over 250,000 Axis troops were trapped in the city. Hitler ordered them to hold their ground, promising supplies by air. But the Luftwaffe couldn't keep up. Inside the pocket, starvation spread. Soldiers froze in cellars, surviving on horse meat and frozen bread. Ammunition ran out. Medics had no bandages. They tore them from the dead. Soviet loudspeakers echoed through the night, telling the Germans to surrender. Every hour you delay means more of you will die. By February 1943, the Sixth Army was finished. 91,000 Germans surrendered. Only about 6,000 would ever return home. Soviet forces raised the red flag over the ruins. Stalingrad had cost nearly 2 million lives, but it shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. As historian Antony Beevor wrote in his book Stalingrad, the city became a symbol of suffering and endurance, a place where hell froze over. But even after Stalingrad, the snow would keep turning red. The front stretched wider, and the killing only grew worse. The Eastern Front's winter wasn't just cold, it was apocalyptic. German troops who marched into Russia in light summer uniforms found themselves buried under snow, with fuel frozen solid and rifles jammed like iron blocks. By December, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Soldiers' boots cracked open, their feet black with frostbite. They huddled around dying fires, tearing pages from Bibles and maps just to feed the flames. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We are no longer human. We are animals waiting to die." The winter didn't just slow the Germans, it devoured them. Horses froze standing up, Fuel trucks turned into ice sculptures. Entire divisions disappeared not by battle, but by exposure. Food convoys never arrived. Crows pecked at corpses frozen in ditches. Civilians in occupied villages suffered even worse. With supplies gone, families burned furniture to stay alive. Children starved in barns while partisans struck German supply lines. Every forest became a trap, every tree a hiding sniper. The Soviets called this their secret ally, General Winter. Trains packed with reinforcements rolled east, carrying soldiers bundled in sheepskin coats, ready for the counterattack. The Red Army had learned how to fight in the cold, how to move silently through blizzards and strike before dawn. Meanwhile, the Germans tried to dig trenches into frozen ground as hard as stone. Their commanders sent desperate radio messages. "We need fuel. We need bread. We need mercy." None came. In the words of one survivor, "Russia itself fought us. The land, the wind, the ice, all of it wanted us dead." By the time the snow began to melt, the front was littered with white bones and rusted steel. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht had been broken not just by Soviet guns, but by nature itself. But as the frost gave way to spring, the war didn't thaw. It only changed form. Deep in the forests, new fighters rose from the ashes, the partisans, guerrillas who would bleed the Nazis from within. They were ordinary men and women, farmers, teachers, and teenagers who had survived the chaos of occupation and refused to bow. By April 1943, partisan units were operating across Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. They struck suddenly, ambushing German supply convoys along muddy dirt roads, derailing trains carrying troops and ammunition, and then disappearing into the dense forests where the enemy could not follow. Every attack was quick, brutal, and calculated to send a message. The land itself would not be conquered. The Germans responded with terrifying ferocity. Any village suspected of aiding partisans was punished as an example. In the summer of 1943, the village of Katyn in Belarus became a symbol of this terror. The Wehrmacht and local collaborators herded the inhabitants into a barn and set it ablaze. By the time the flames died, 149 men, women, and children were dead, their bodies reduced to charred remains. Streets were left empty, homes destroyed, and the forest around became silent, except for the wind through the blackened trees. Public hangings and shootings became common, meant to terrify anyone even considering resistance. Yet the partisans persisted. They learned to move with the seasons, striking supply lines when the Germans were vulnerable and melting away before reinforcements arrived. They built secret caches in the woods and communicated across villages using messengers and hidden signals. In some regions, entire families joined the fight, blurring the lines between soldier and civilian. These guerrillas disrupted German logistics more effectively than any conventional army could, causing food shortages, delaying reinforcements, and sapping morale. Soviet reports estimate that partisans killed as many as 500,000 German troops and collaborators over the course of the war, a staggering number considering the irregular nature of their campaigns. Their victories were rarely celebrated publicly. Instead, each successful ambush was a whisper of hope, a proof that the occupiers were not invincible. At the same time, the cost to local populations was catastrophic. Villages were razed, crops destroyed, and survivors forced to rebuild amid constant fear. Yet these acts of defiance kept the German army stretched thin, preventing it from concentrating forces and slowing their progress toward Moscow and Stalingrad. By the end of 1943, partisan warfare had become a shadow war across the Eastern Front, an invisible yet lethal web that tied down tens of thousands of German troops. They were not just fighting for territory, but for survival and vengeance. Every forest, swamp, and field was a battlefield where the occupier could never rest. And then came the unimaginable. Entire communities wiped off the map in a single day, leaving only smoke, ash, and the echo of cries in the wind. Across Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, massacres became a terrifying routine. The world remembers Oradour-sur-Glane in France, the image of one village annihilated, but the scale on the Eastern Front dwarfed anything in Western Europe. In Katyn, Belarus, on March 22, 1943, the entire village was rounded up by the SS and local collaborators. Families were herded into barns and set on fire. Survivors recounted children clinging to their mothers, screaming as flames consumed the building. By the end, 149 people had perished. Streets were left silent, scorched earth where homes once stood, the forest around blackened as if mourning. The Germans carried out these atrocities according to a chilling formula. For every German soldier killed by partisans, up to 100 civilians could be executed in reprisal. Villages were systematically burned, wells poisoned, livestock slaughtered. Entire communities vanished. Officers photographed executions, not as evidence, but for propaganda, proof of obedience, and the necessity of terror. Local civilians who had no connection to the fighting were killed simply because they lived near partisan activity. Historian Timothy Snyder notes that the Nazis treated the land itself as a battlefield, where no distinction existed between fighters and civilians. Soviet soldiers, pushed by vengeance and anger, matched brutality with brutality. As they recaptured territory, captured German soldiers were frequently executed rather than taken prisoner. Reports from the Nuremberg trials reveal that tens of thousands of German POWs were killed after surrendering, sometimes in acts of mass shooting, sometimes after being tortured for information. These retaliations were fueled by decades of propaganda, political indoctrination, and personal losses. Soldiers who had watched their towns burned or families executed had little room for mercy. The Eastern Front became a place where rules of warfare ceased to exist, replaced by raw, unrelenting hatred. Entire regions became graveyards. Between 1941 and 1944, more than 600 villages in Belarus alone were completely destroyed, according to Nuremberg documents. Some were razed so thoroughly that only foundations remained. Archaeological surveys today uncover fragments of household items, scorched bricks, and mass graves, providing a haunting record of what eyewitnesses could hardly put into words. Diaries from survivors describe stumbling over charred human remains while scavenging for food, or finding the skeletal frames of their neighbors buried hastily in frozen soil. The massacres were not limited to Belarus. Ukraine saw similar horrors at places like Babi Yar, where more than 33,000 Jews were shot over 2 days in September 1941. Entire towns in Western Russia, like Novyi Bykov, were burned and depopulated, leaving nothing behind. The scale of human loss, combined with the intentional destruction of homes, crops, and infrastructure, ensured that survivors faced starvation, homelessness, and psychological trauma long after the battles had moved on. By 1943, it was clear that both armies had abandoned any pretense of following the rules of war. Civilians were no longer bystanders. They were targets, pawns, and weapons in a conflict that had grown beyond strategy or territory. For the people trapped in this inferno, survival often depended on hiding in the forests, fleeing to ruins, or joining the partisans themselves. The landscape was littered with burned villages, shattered bodies, and memories that would haunt the survivors forever. On July 5, 1943, near the city of Kursk, over 6,000 tanks rolled across the open fields in what would become the largest tank battle in history. German commanders unleashed their latest weapons, Tiger IIs and Panther tanks, expecting their technological edge to shatter the Soviet defenses. Instead, they met a wall of preparation and sheer determination. The Soviets had mined fields with thousands of hidden explosives and dug in artillery that cut swaths through advancing columns. Villages along the front line became graveyards of both metal and flesh, with burning tanks smoldering beside collapsed homes, their walls pocked with shell fragments. Soviet soldiers had learned from past defeats. They held their positions with brutal tenacity, often choosing to fight to the last man rather than retreat. Red Army reports describe infantry crawling through trenches under scorching sun, dodging machine gun fire while tank crews pushed forward through mud and rubble. Witnesses recalled columns of smoke stretching for miles and the roar of engines mixing with screams of wounded men. Civilians caught in the path were again forced to hide in basements or flee, sometimes only to find their homes turned into rubble by both sides' bombardments. The psychological strain was enormous. Soldiers on both sides spoke of exhaustion and fear so intense it was almost paralyzing, yet the pressure from commanding officers left no room for hesitation. The German plan had hinged on a rapid breakthrough, aiming to encircle Soviet forces and force a decisive victory. By the end of the first week, it was clear that the Wehrmacht's momentum had stalled. Soviet reserves launched counterattacks from prepared positions, striking German flanks and forcing retreats. Fields that had once been golden with wheat now burned under the fury of artillery and tank shells. Casualties mounted rapidly. Antony Beevor notes that in just the first week, tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed or wounded, and the landscape was forever scarred with craters, twisted metal, and the bones of both men and animals. By July 16th, the Germans had been decisively repelled. Kursk was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a symbol of a turning tide. The Red Army now held the initiative, pushing westward in a relentless advance that would continue for years. But victory came at a staggering cost. Entire towns along the front were flattened, civilian populations decimated, and refugees were left to navigate a landscape that had become unrecognizable. Survivors recounted seeing burned-out tanks littering fields where they had once played as children, and scorched villages where neighbors and families had vanished overnight. U.S. Army War College historians would later call Kursk the death knell of the Wehrmacht, highlighting the loss of German men and materiel that could never be replaced. Yet for the Soviet people, the end of Kursk was not a moment of celebration. The war had transformed entire regions into a living nightmare, where every step forward meant more suffering and death. It was a Pyrrhic victory in a war that had already consumed millions of lives. And as German forces reeled from their defeat, retreating westward under constant pressure, the shadow of vengeance lingered. Liberated territories were not met with relief, but with the ferocity of those who had endured unimaginable horrors, ready to repay every atrocity in kind. By the spring of 1944, the Red Army had rebuilt itself into a force capable of carrying the full weight of vengeance. Months of training, combined with the relentless pressure of German retreats, meant that Soviet units were moving westward with purpose and fury. From Belarus through Ukraine and into Poland, towns and villages that had once been occupied by the Wehrmacht now found themselves facing the wrath of those who had endured years of occupation, starvation, and terror. Streets that had seen forced labor and deportations now ran red with reprisals. Civilians, especially Germans living near the front lines, were not spared. Reports from liberated areas describe entire villages being burned to the ground, sometimes with families still inside, as Soviet soldiers enacted an unspoken rule of an eye for an eye. Women were assaulted, property was looted, and anyone suspected of collaboration was executed. The logic was chillingly simple. If the Germans had no mercy for Soviet civilians, then the Soviets would repay every act in full. Historical documents preserved in Naimark's research note that units often left little behind: smoldering homes, destroyed churches, and shattered families, all meant as both punishment and warning. Propaganda played a powerful role in justifying these acts. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts framed the violence as righteous retribution, portraying the advancing Red Army as the embodiment of justice for atrocities committed during the occupation. Posters showed German soldiers and civilians alike as monsters, reinforcing the idea that the suffering inflicted on them was deserved. This narrative gave soldiers and civilians alike a sense of moral vindication, even as the scale of destruction escalated. In cities like Lvov in western Ukraine, local survivors reported seeing entire blocks reduced to rubble within hours. German soldiers who had retreated earlier were often hunted down, sometimes summarily executed, and POW camps were overwhelmed with prisoners caught in the chaos. The Western Front of the Soviet advance resembled a tide that could not be stopped, sweeping away both resistance and innocence alike. Personal testimonies from Polish villagers describe the horror of being caught in this storm, where neighbors and former collaborators were rounded up and executed, while the landscape was left unrecognizable. By mid-1944, the psychological impact on both sides was enormous. German troops, already demoralized from battlefield defeats like Kursk, were now confronted with an enemy whose hatred was personal, direct, and merciless. The Red Army's advance was no longer just military. It was emotional and vengeful, a reflection of the years of unimaginable suffering suffered behind enemy lines. Civilians who survived the initial occupation now faced a new reality. The so-called liberation was accompanied by violence and retribution that few could escape. As the Soviets crossed into German territories in late 1944, the intensity of vengeance reached its peak. Villages were emptied, churches burned, and communities that had existed for centuries were obliterated in a matter of days. Historical records show that the advance often left physical scars as lasting as the psychological ones. Entire towns erased, fields turned to ash, and infrastructure destroyed beyond repair. And yet, for all the fury unleashed, the war was far from over. The Red Army was now at the gates of the Third Reich itself, poised to enter the heart of Germany. The horrors of revenge had only just begun, and what awaited both soldiers and civilians behind those gates would push the boundaries of human endurance and cruelty even further. By early 1945, East Prussia had become a landscape of panic and despair. German civilians, sensing the unstoppable advance of the Red Army, fled in massive columns through snowbound forests and across frozen rivers. Families clutched what little they could carry. Children trudged alongside exhausted parents, and the elderly struggled through knee-deep snow. The winter was merciless, and the Soviet forces were relentless. Tanks rumbled along icy roads, artillery pounded retreating columns, and fighter planes strafed the fleeing civilians, turning flight into a living nightmare. Ships were pressed into service to evacuate as many people as possible, but the seas offered little safety. The Wilhelm Gustloff, a passenger liner turned refugee transport, became the scene of unimaginable tragedy. On January 30th, 1945, Soviet submarines torpedoed the ship in the icy waters of the Baltic Sea. Panic spread as lifeboats were smashed, children screamed, and thousands plunged into freezing water. Over 9,000 people died in a single night, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in history, surpassing both the Titanic and the Lusitania. Survivors later described the water as a field of corpses, frozen hands reaching out from the icy grip of death. Other ships, like the Goya and the General von Steuben, suffered similar fates, adding to the mounting toll of civilian lives lost. Those who managed to escape the seas were not safe. Refugees faced hunger, frostbite, and disease as they pushed on toward Western Germany. Villages along the escape routes were often destroyed or occupied by Soviet forces, leaving few places to rest or find food. Letters and diaries recovered after the war describe families forced to eat raw potatoes or bark to survive, while bodies of those who succumbed to cold lay in the snow unburied for days. The psychological toll was immense. Parents buried children along the roadside, neighbors abandoned one another, and communities that had existed for centuries were scattered in hours. Even as Soviet troops advanced, their behavior mirrored the fury that had driven the earlier campaigns in Belarus and Poland. Revenge remained a guiding force. Soldiers entered towns with the memory of occupation fresh in their minds, and civilians who remained in East Prussia often faced summary executions, assaults, and looting. Historian Norman Neymark notes that in East Prussia alone, tens of thousands of German civilians were killed or wounded as the Red Army swept through, turning retreat into a slaughter. By the end of February 1945, East Prussia was effectively emptied. Snow-covered villages lay in ruins, frozen rivers bore the marks of desperate crossings, and the roads to the west were littered with remnants of both human and material tragedy. The combination of harsh winter, unrelenting attacks, and sheer panic had created a scenario of mass suffering almost unimaginable. Survivors carried scars that would last a lifetime, their memories of the flight from East Prussia shaped by horror, desperation, and loss. And yet, even after this cataclysm, the war's shadow stretched further west. Berlin, the symbolic heart of the Third Reich, awaited the Red Army's final assault. April 1945 arrived with a bitter chill over Berlin, and the Red Army poured into the city like an unstoppable flood. The streets, once bustling with life, were now rivers of rubble and ash. Buildings stood as skeletal reminders of weeks of relentless bombing and artillery shelling. Civilians who had not fled were trapped in basements and attics, listening to the thunder of tanks rolling past and the sharp crack of gunfire echoing down ruined avenues. Children huddled with their mothers, and elderly residents clung to what little dignity remained, watching as their city became a battlefield of unimaginable scale. The fighting was merciless and intimate. Soviet troops advanced street by street, often clearing buildings room by room. Snipers lurked in the ruins, and the roar of flamethrowers and grenades filled the air. German soldiers, many of them teenage boys and older men barely able to carry their rifles, resisted fiercely, but exhaustion and despair gnawed at their resolve. The Volkssturm, a hastily formed militia of civilians, joined in the defense, throwing what little ammunition and weaponry they had into the chaos. Streets became graveyards, with corpses strewn across intersections, bodies pinned beneath collapsed walls, and the stench of death rising from every corner. The civilian toll was devastating. Historian Antony Beevor documents that more than 100,000 women were raped during the final days of Berlin, a grim testament to the breakdown of order and humanity. Families were torn apart. Parents watched children disappear, and neighbors betrayed one another for scraps of food or a safe corner to hide. Fires consumed what remained of homes, and the air was thick with smoke and dust, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and makeshift clinics could not cope with the wounded. Hunger and disease claimed lives almost as quickly as the shelling, leaving survivors weakened and broken. Even Hitler's final act, suicide on April 30th, 1945, did little to stop the suffering. The city continued to burn, soldiers continued to fight, and civilians continued to die. The Führerbunker, the symbol of Nazi power, became a tomb of shattered ambitions and bitter defeat. Yet while the Reich's leadership had collapsed, the human cost of the Eastern Front lingered everywhere, in the ruined streets, in the haunted faces of survivors, and in the scars that would never fade. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of brutal fighting and personal loss, often took vengeance on German civilians as they pushed through the city. Looting, executions, and assaults were tragically common. Entire blocks were obliterated as artillery pounded targets with little distinction between military and civilian. The psychological trauma was immense, and the survivors' testimonies later recounted screams that seemed endless, a symphony of fear and grief that filled the city even after the shooting stopped. By May 2, 1945, Berlin had officially fallen, but the price had been staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers dead, hundreds of thousands of civilians killed, and the city itself reduced to ash. The Eastern Front, with its scale of suffering, cruelty, and devastation, had reached a climax here. Yet the human story was far from over. Survivors faced a new reality, one of displacement, hunger, and mourning, while the ghosts of the front loomed over every life. When the guns fell silent, the scars of this front were just beginning to show. When the guns finally fell silent, the land itself seemed to mourn. Cities were reduced to charred skeletons of buildings, villages were gone, and entire forests still bore the scars of artillery fire. In Belarus alone, nearly a quarter of the population had vanished, killed in massacres, starved, or forced into exile. Streets were littered with the remnants of homes, belongings scattered and ruined, and in some places, human bones still surfaced decades later, reminders of the sudden and total destruction. Survivors wandered through this devastation, often carrying children orphaned by the war, searching for what little remained of family or friends. The grief was endless, the silence of the dead pressing into every corner of the ruined towns. Millions were displaced, drifting from one makeshift shelter to another, often in frozen winters or torrid summers, seeking food and warmth in a continent turned hostile to its own people. Some fled west, others east, but no direction offered safety. Families were torn apart not only by bombs and bullets, but also by ideology. Soviet soldiers returned victorious but scarred, carrying the weight of revenge they had inflicted and endured. Civilians who had survived were haunted by what they had seen and done, trapped in a world where morality had been suspended for survival. Diaries from survivors recount the endless mourning, the quiet grief that made even laughter impossible, and the persistent fear that death could return at any moment. Psychological scars were as deep as physical ones. Post-traumatic stress followed millions of soldiers and civilians, leaving them haunted by nightmares of the massacres, the screams, and the unrelenting cold. Entire communities struggled to rebuild, but the infrastructure of everyday life was gone. Schools, hospitals, and churches had been destroyed, replaced by rubble and ashes. Hunger lingered even after the war officially ended, with food shortages and famine continuing in many regions for months, sometimes years. Survivors often spoke of the silence, the eerie emptiness of towns that once thrived, now echoing with memories too painful to voice. The human toll was staggering. UN estimates put total Soviet deaths, both military and civilian, at 27 million. Entire generations were lost, leaving gaps in families and villages that could never be repaired. Farmers returned to fields littered with unexploded shells, trains and roads destroyed, and the ever-present smell of decay. Graves were hastily dug, mass burials common, often without markers, leaving families uncertain if they would ever know the fate of loved ones. Historical records, photographs, and testimonies preserved fragments of these tragedies. But no statistic could fully convey the scale of human suffering. Despite the Soviet victory, the cost was incalculable. Cities had been liberated, the Nazi regime defeated, but the survivors were left to pick through the remnants of life, mourning what had been lost. Children who had known nothing but hunger, fear, and death struggled to understand a world that had been so cruel. Adults bore guilt for actions taken in moments of survival, and the cultural memory of the Eastern Front became one of pain, resilience, and silence. Villages and towns took decades to recover, often rebuilt on the bones of the dead, and even then the psychological shadows remained. And yet, even as the survivors tried to rebuild, history remembered only half of the horror. Western narratives often celebrated the Allied victory in broad strokes, highlighting battles in France or Italy, while overlooking the vast scale of suffering and slaughter on the Eastern Front. Millions of lives, entire communities erased, and the daily terror endured by civilians and soldiers alike were largely reduced to footnotes. The true cost of humanity pushed to its limits, of vengeance and cruelty, of survival under unimaginable conditions, lingered in silence, waiting for the world to remember. But the question remained: how could a continent rebuild when so much had been destroyed? And how could memory ever do justice to the lives lost on this forgotten front? Even as Europe struggled to rebuild, much of the story of the Eastern Front remained buried. Newspapers in London or New York rarely reported the scale of suffering in Belarus, Ukraine, or the shattered cities of Russia. Stories of mass starvation in Leningrad or the complete destruction of villages like Katyn were relegated to footnotes. Soviet records existed, but they were locked away behind tightly controlled archives, inaccessible to the West. Propaganda from both sides shaped what people knew. The Soviets painted themselves as liberators. The West emphasized their own campaigns, and the grim reality of 27 million dead was left in shadow. Hollywood films of the 1940s and 1950s reinforced this narrow focus. Normandy, the liberation of Paris, and battles in Italy were dramatized with cinematic flair. The Eastern Front, with its freezing winters, endless forests, and civilian massacres, seemed too vast and brutal to portray. American and British audiences saw war as a fight between good and evil with clear heroes, but on the Eastern Front, the lines blurred. Civilians were both victims and instruments of war. Armies committed atrocities, and survival itself was an act of courage. The Cold War further shaped memory. Once the Iron Curtain fell, Western historians began accessing Soviet archives and discovering the diaries, letters, and documents that had been hidden for decades. Accounts of partisans derailing trains, entire towns burned in reprisals, and survivors writing of starvation and mass graves began to emerge. Scholars like Catherine Meredale argue that this silence shaped public understanding for decades, leaving the Western world with an incomplete, often sanitized image of the largest and deadliest theater of World War II. Families in Eastern Europe struggled to preserve memory amid political upheaval. Graves went unmarked, local histories were suppressed, and the sheer scale of loss made personal storytelling almost impossible. Survivors often told their stories quietly, passing them down in whispers rather than public testimony. Photographs hidden in drawers, letters tucked away in cupboards, and diaries buried with their authors became the fragments that slowly reconstructed the narrative of horror. And yet, small pieces of truth began to surface, one diary, one photograph at a time. Even decades later, the Eastern Front refuses to let go of its stories. The world has long focused on the suffering of the Jews, and rightly so, yet in doing so, it has allowed tens of millions of other victims to fade into shadows. Soldiers, civilians, entire cities, Slavs, Poles, and Russians were annihilated at a scale that dwarfs most Western narratives. Entire towns burned, forests became mass graves, and the bitter winters killed as surely as bullets. Diaries, photographs, and survivor testimonies slowly reconstruct a reality that Western audiences were kept from seeing. A war where ideology was a weapon and people were expendable. Hitler's vision didn't just target Jews. Slavs were considered subhuman, political officers were executed on sight, and ordinary citizens became collateral. In turn, the Red Army's revenge spared no one. German villages in East Prussia and Poland were flattened, women assaulted, men shot, and children left to die in the cold. Survivors wrote of eating leaves, sawdust bread, even their own pets. Forests hid partisans striking suddenly, only to vanish again into shadows. The Eastern Front wasn't a conflict. It was an endless crucible of cruelty where ideology swallowed humanity whole. Numbers tell part of the story, but they cannot convey the horror. The Soviet Union lost around 27 million people, military and civilian, while German losses on the Eastern Front exceeded 5 million soldiers. Belarus alone lost a quarter of its population. Cities like Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Warsaw were reduced to rubble, their landscapes permanently scarred. Yet in Western classrooms and media, these figures are often glossed over, overshadowed by narratives that center American and Western experiences. The deaths of millions, the suffering of those who were not Jewish, became almost invisible in the story we tell about the war. This selective memory shapes how modern Europe and the West view the Eastern Front. Monuments exist, but they are few, and the silence of decades allowed myths to take hold. That the East was simply a backdrop, or that its people were participants rather than victims. Diaries, hidden photographs, and letters that surface slowly remind us that humanity can vanish, not just under enemy fire, but under ideology, hatred, and vengeance. To read them is to confront a world consumed by war, where every moral boundary was obliterated. And yet, despite the evidence, much of the world still underestimates what happened. Millions of lives were erased, cities turned to ash, and winters claimed more than armies could count. The Eastern Front proves that war is not a sequence of battles. It is a test of endurance, morality, and empathy. And in forgetting the suffering of tens of millions beyond the Holocaust, we risk repeating the same blindness, ignoring the scale of human destruction until history strikes again. Because every empire forgets until it repeats, the Eastern Front was more than a war. It was a nightmare that unfolded across frozen plains, burned villages, and shattered lives. Every number you've heard hides a frozen child, a family lost, a soldier broken beyond repair. The ground still carries those scars. And yet, most of the world hardly noticed, focused on battles far from this horror. The worst of World War II didn't happen in the West. It happened here. In the next video, we'll see what happened to those who survived, fled, or escaped, and how justice, sometimes slow, sometimes harsh, finally caught up with them.